Welcome to a new session on ethics. In this session, we will discuss ethics of Francis Herbert Bradley. Francis Herbert Bradley was an influential English philosopher of the absolute idealist school. Bradley's view of morality was driven by his criticism of the idea of self used in the current utilitarian theories of ethics. However, on later generations of philosophers, Bradley's contributions to moral philosophy and the philosophy of logic were far more influential than his metaphysics. His critical examination of hedonism, the view that the goal of morality is the maximization of general pleasure, was influential and stands as a permanent contribution to the subject which can still be read with profit today. Bradley's views on ethics were expressed at length in his first widely acknowledged publication, Ethical Studies. His ethical view proceeds by turning to the question, "Why should I be moral?" which he answers by suggesting that the moral end for each of us is self-realization. Criticism of earlier theories. As a critic of hedonistic utilitarianism, Bradley argues that its individualism is insupportable, as is its hedonistic conception of happiness as a pleasurable state identifiable independently of the means by which it is attained, so that it could in principle be achieved more conveniently than through moral behavior. After an examination of Kantian ethics of duty, he argues that from this conception of morality, we should abandon, as the result of a false abstraction, its idea that duty should be done just for duty's sake. We can, however, retain the insight that morality requires the performance of individual duties. These theories are inadequate because they have a deficient conception of the self. Social conception of self. In his famous essay, My Station and Its Duties, he outlines a social conception of the self and of morality with such dynamism that it is understandable that the mistaken idea that it expresses his own position has gained some prevalence. He argues that any actual society may exhibit moral imperfections requiring reform from the standpoint of an ideal which cannot be exemplified in the roles available within that society. In the next essay, he discusses the scope of morality's demands on the individual, and by a further natural extension into the seventh essay's discussion of the distinction between the good and the bad self, a discussion which involves an attempted demonstration that the bad self is a kind of unrealizable parasite on the good. Realization of the ideal self is thus unattainable through morality, but the book closes by suggesting that it is still possible in religion. The basic data for analysis of moral action come from observing the practical judgments ordinary people make and their understanding and use of normative concepts. The role of the philosopher is to explain this moral world rather than to generate principles dictating how people should act. In this respect, Bradley offers a descriptive rather than a perspective ethical theory. Bradley claims that proving that the ultimate end of action is self-realization would require establishing the nature of the self of reality and the process of realization. Bradley begins his study of morality and the moral agent with an analysis of the ordinary person's understanding of moral responsibility. Problem with hedonism and deontology. Bradley examines teleological hedonism and deontological theories and finds both unacceptable. Deontological theories fail because they place no constraints on what can be willed by a moral agent, and so no specific end is indicated and none bad. Deontology is one-sided and abstract. It is focused on the universal aspect of the will and disregarded the other, equally important particular element. What is in fact missing is any adequate psychological account of desire which explains how we are motivated to do specific things to make specific choices. By contrast, ethical hedonism makes the opposite mistake of focusing on the particular to the detriment of the universal side. Classical utilitarianism, for example, sees particular pleasant states as the goal of action, but cannot present any of these as having any intrinsic value, for they are only means to the maximization of pleasure and could be replaced by any other means that were more or equally effective. A sum of pleasures or a maximum of pleasures cannot be the end moral agents are to aim for. Pleasure and pain are feelings which are as they are felt to be, but they tell us nothing. In a word, they have no content. They are states of us, but they have nothing for us. Analysis of sensations. Bradley recognizes that we talk as though we do, using expressions which appear to entail that pleasures and pains have immediately given felt qualities, but he offers an explanation of why this is so. He starts with the observation that while it is uncertain whether all sensations are colored by pain and pleasure, it is certain that without sensation we never have pleasure or pain. Just as sensations never occur apart from some psychic context which may make a significant difference to the sensation, neither do pleasures nor pains exist apart from sensation. He goes on to assert that pains and pleasures have no qualities of their own, it being the quality of the sensations or arrangements of sensations which we place to their credit. The kinds of pain which have been urged in disproof of the above, the feelings that shoot or that burn or bother, are each due to the special sort of sensations together with the rhythm of intensity in the pain. If this is true, it offers a reason why we mistake a quantitative for a qualitative difference, namely that we mistake variations in sensory intensities and intensity patterns over time with which pleasure is attached or attendant for qualitative differences in the pleasures themselves. Given that further features of the overall experience are said to be attributable to the powers of the sensations, these appear to be the causal agents. If this interpretation is correct, pains and pleasures are epiphenomena. For present purposes, the importance of this is that it bolsters the idealist argument that pleasure cannot be the end of rational action, leave alone the ultimate end of moral action. It also explains the so-called paradox of hedonism. Both of the views of hedonism and deontology approach morality from the perspective of the individual person. This individual is treated as a fully formed moral agent independent of any social relations. Each one is able to decide what is morally required by consulting a formal principle in their mind or their own feeling states. In responding to individualism, which he thinks ultimately rests on a false theory of human nature, Bradley's worry as far as morality is concerned is that it reflects a kind of egoistic antagonism to other people that makes morality impossible. If the self we are to realize is an atom, a unit which repels other units and can have nothing in itself but what is exclusively its feelings, its pleasure and pain, then it is certain that it can stand to others with their pleasures and pains only in external relation and since it is the end, the others must be the means and nothing but the means. On such a basis, morality is impossible. It is impossible because since morality requires being an organic whole, social relations that are external defeat that goal. In opposition to individualism, Bradley endorses the thesis of holism. Ethics of holism. Empirical evidence which shows us that people born at different times and places and born into this or that cultural or religious or ethnic group will tend to inherit the practices and attitudes of those by whom they are raised. He does think of children as born with certain natural needs and desires and with certain aptitudes and latent possibilities, but these need nurturing and some of these tendencies need to be civilized. These civilized tendencies are part of the essence of the child. He would only partly be himself without them. He owes them to his ancestors and his ancestors owe them to society. The language a community speaks has to be truly public with understood and accepted meanings for its central terms on pain of ending with nobody ever understanding what anyone else is talking about. The language also has embedded in it, as it were, the values and beliefs of the community that speaks it. In passing on its language to the children, a society is passing on its values, its understanding of its institutions, and so on. As Bradley says, for each child, learning to speak the language carries into his mind the ideas and sentiments of the race and stamps them in permanently. This child also observes and comes to participate in the practices of the society. He grows up in an atmosphere of example and general custom. Holism has ramifications for the theory of self-realization because if one's social relations are constitutive of what one is, then the self is only realized when it recognizes and endorses the duties it has a member of a community, a family, a state, and so on. At this point, the self's perspective shifts from subjective feelings and goals of the individual to the idea of moral obligations that are objective in that they hold for all in the community and also objective in that one has them no matter what personal desires one might have. Of course, with the recognition that one is a member of the community, the situation will not be construed as them forcing me to behave a certain way, but will give rise to genuine collective intentionality to viewing things in terms of what we believe and value. One key thing that happens at this stage is that the idea of realizing the self is now given specific content. Society offers the homogeneity and specificity that moral development demands. Social life not only provides a greater degree of homogeneity in that it removes the